Welcome to the Cashflow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner. This is where we make investing simple. My guest today is Alex Durante, and he is a tax expert. He does a lot of work for the government, and I'm sure some of you have read some of the articles and blogs he's put out, especially recently, where our fiscal challenges are well, let's just say they're formidable. And so if you like our discussion, be sure to subscribe, hit your like button, hit your notification bell, and also for more financial education, drop by yourinvestingclass.com. Got a great ebook right there now that you can download a little more about, learn a little bit more about the numbers that will affect your life personally. So with that, let's hop right in. Alex, first of all, thanks for taking some time to be on the podcast.
Sure, thanks for having me on.
This will be great. Let's give a little bit of your background. How does a person decide they want to do what you do, and what led you to your current career and your current path?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of have an interesting career trajectory. I've always been interested in the fiscal policy space, tax and spending, but I've had several different jobs in Washington, D.C. So I was at Tax Foundation, my current employer, for a year as a fellow back in 2015, 2016, when we were working on developing our tax model. And then after that, I went to work on a household survey at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. And then after about 3 years of doing that, I spent a year and a half at the White House from 2019 to 2020 working in the Council of Economic Advisors, mostly on trade policy, so not tax and fiscal issues. And then I joined the Tax Foundation in early 2021, and I've been here since, and I continue to work on trade policy because tariffs are taxes, but I also work on a variety of other tax policy issues as well.
So it's an interesting intersection. Those three policies we have. You can have a trade surplus or trade deficit. You can have a fiscal surplus or fiscal deficit. And we also have monetary policy that wants to blame fiscal, and then fiscal blames monetary. Right. Mm-hmm. Those congressional hearings are always interesting to see that banter back and forth. But this is great stuff. I'm so grateful to have you on because you can disagree with anything I say. I welcome opposing opinions. Mm-hmm. And most of the listeners know I try not to be too dogmatic. I try to keep an open mind. My opinion is that there's really no government policy that could generate the horsepower to compensate for a poor personal fiscal policy. In other words, when I wake up in the morning, I have the feeling that the locus of control is still within myself. That I can decide whether to become educated and invest well, or start a business, or I just believe in entrepreneurs and to our detriment often. Entrepreneurs and investors often feel like, look, I'm in control of my life. Mm-hmm. Just tell me what the rules are. Tax policy is the government's carrot and stick to try to get me to do this or get me to do that. And if I understand they're a carrot and a stick, and I understand tax policy, I can navigate this. So as a kind of this independent locus of control inside myself. Other people, and particularly those that get involved in Harris campaigns or Trump campaigns, they think the opposite. Boy, you get the wrong person in there, your whole life is going to end. And I did an AI search of every George Washington stepped down, so he ran unopposed. But it was funny, even in the Thomas Jefferson election, his opponent said, Thomas Jefferson is an existential threat to the United States. We will not exist if he is elected. So that rhetoric gives people the idea that no, I mean, whoever's in charge, if the Democrats or Republicans, boy, it's, you really have to get it right. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So tell me a little bit about how important tax policy is. And obviously, of all the government policies, regulation, right, and tax policy are the two biggest headwinds that I face as an entrepreneur, burdened with incredible regulations and also burdened with taxes. So with that long-winded opining, take it away.
Sure. Well, the first thing is, I mean, I'm happy to say that we take a more measured approach here with a lot of these things, and I certainly do in my own life. Tax policy.
Yeah.
Tax policy is, very important for the economy. But we also have to understand that the Republicans, for instance, I mean, right now they have very narrow majorities in Congress, even though they control, even though they have all the presidency and the Senate and the House. But with that narrow majority, there is only so much they can accomplish, and I think you're going to hear a lot of there's some pie in the sky ideas coming from the Trump campaign, and it's really uncertain how much of that they're going to actually be able to get through Congress because they are constrained by certain budgetary rules. But to get to sort of your broader question, I mean, we know, and I think tax policy experts across the political spectrum really agree on this. Tax policy does influence economic behavior. It influences, how many hours, people are going to work, how much investment businesses are going to undertake. So it is something that we have to pay attention to, and I think we really have to pay attention to it, especially now because I'm not sure if you're aware or if your listener is aware of this, but many of the tax cuts that were passed in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act under President Trump are going to be expiring at the end of 2025. What this means is that about 62% of households across the U.S. will see a tax increase on average of about $2,500. So you can think of that as being almost like they'll have an extra mortgage payment every year, which is a very significant amount of income. So I think it's going to be imperative that the Republicans right now find some way to kind of navigate this and do as much as they can. I think to preserve those policies so that the tax-paying Americans are not hit with these very large tax burdens next year and for the forthcoming years as well.
So the argument, and let's talk about fiscal policy for a moment, because there was a wonderful, I consider him a statesman, really, David Walker, who was the Comptroller General of the United States. He ran the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, and he quit, many say in disgust, because he was very much a bipartisan guy. He worked under both Republican and Democratic administrations. And he did say that this, speaking of existential threats, he said something to this effect. He said, the biggest threat to America, and this is during the hunt for bin Laden years, he said the biggest threat to America isn't someone hiding in a cave in Afghanistan. The biggest threat to America is our own fiscal irresponsibility. And he highlighted, and this is interesting with tax policy and borrowing, is once you pass a budget, you really have what are the resources to pay for those expenses? Well, you have $4 trillion of taxes you can pull. But if you have a if you have a $6 trillion spending, you got a couple trillion there you got to come up with. And a lot of that money comes from what I would describe as promised money rather than borrowed money. In other words, we have $36 trillion that's been borrowed. It's been funded. They've sold the bonds. Those have been funded, by bond purchasers, and we have those bonds. But the promised money, are things like, pensions, Social Security, medical dependents will want their Medicare, and the numbers I've seen, according to the Federal Reserve, are north of $200 trillion now. So when you have a gross domestic product, which is really the pie from which you can draw taxes, how much of that pie can we take, and where should that you have? I think it'd be really bad to be on the Ways and Means Committee, and a lot more fun to be on the Allocations Committee, where money's allocated rather than how we get it. But this big promised money time bomb that I see will have to convert into debt or taxes. In other words, we've got to look at that and either grow the GDP to pull sufficient taxes, which isn't realistic with that disproportionality, I don't think. So what's your thought on that? As you mingle with the people in your circles trying to come up with tax policy and try to counsel Congress on this, how do you feel about the fiscal future?
Yeah, I recall, I think over the past year, we were hearing certain perspectives. Oh, well, we have this large fiscal problem, but we could just sort of grow our way out of this. If we get, say, 4% GDP growth, the problem goes away. I mean, look, I love economic growth. Economic growth is great, but it's not enough to fix this problem. As you may have seen on, some of the writings on our website, Tax Foundation, I've talked about the Social Security issue. And look, the reality is that by the end of 2033, we're only going to be, the trust fund's only going to be able to fund 79% of those scheduled benefits, which means that either there will have to be an immediate cut of 21% in benefits, or the payroll taxes will have to go up to fund that deficit. So either way, the only way out of this solution is you either have to raise taxes, cut spending, or do some combination of both. And I think the idea that we could just kind of ignore this problem, which is unfortunately what I think both parties right now are inclined to do. I think the idea that we could just ignore this and grow our way out of this problem, it's just not, the math just doesn't work.
Taxes are difficult for all kinds of Americans, and the reason is tax rates don't really accommodate the vicissitudes of a person's personal life or business, particularly business. As a business owner, one of the frustrations I have is, I would really like to create some nest eggs for a rainy day, and it's not surprising the government would be lost on this, because they certainly don't have any constraints on, we'll have a big saber rattling session over the debt ceiling like we always do, and someone will threaten to turn down, shut down the government, and they'll saber rattle, and then at the 11th hour, someone like Janet Yellen will, say, hey, this is terrible, and we'll raise the debt ceiling. I don't have that luxury. It would be so nice to, because if you have a large tax burden as a business, you're not allowed to rainy day money, because you got to pay taxes on that all the time. Even if, you either have to spend that money to try to grow now to, have a business expense, but to carry over from December to January, you're just not allowed to put it in a rainy day. And then if you have a rougher year, which we've been fortunate not to, but if you were to have a rougher year, it can take you out, and you have no ability to build a nest egg because you're getting taxed. It's a tough burden. So while I still get up in the morning and think, well, that's just life, I got to deal with it, I can't be a victim. Taxes is why should someone listen to you and listen to this podcast? 2 reasons. Number one, taxes is your largest expense in your life. It's more in your home, it's more in your car. If you add up all the sin taxes and the food taxes and the gas taxes and the hotel taxes and the income taxes and the federal tax, it's the largest money sucker out of your life that you have. And obviously as a business, it's a big deal. So the other reason I think it's important is, as an electorate, we have to understand the realities of the unsustainability. So what would you say to the average person who already feels like they're burdened with tax? Taxes are going up, yeah? I mean, can the Trump administration stop this from happening? What's your opinion?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I mean, from the conversations that we've been privy to, I mean, the administration, or rather, I should say, Congress members, I mean, they're working, very, very diligently to address this issue, because I think it's very unlikely that really members of both parties are just going to allow all of these tax cuts to expire and then hit all these tax-paying Americans with additional burdens. The question is, how do we get there, right? Because they are constrained, by certain budgetary rules under reconciliation. They can't the budget. I mean, they can't have a certain deficit increase outside of the 10-year window. And right now it seemed, I mean, the latest numbers I saw from the Trump campaign, they had trillions of dollars in tax cuts, and I think only maybe about half of those were going to be paid for through other provisions. A lot, I think, their hope was that they could use tariffs, to pay for this, which I think is also a mistake. And maybe we could get into that discussion.
That was actually I have that written down as my next question. You're perfect.
Yeah, maybe we can get to that discussion as well. But I think what's going to happen is, the Republicans, I think, will. I think they will preserve the individual tax cuts that were enacted in 2017, but I think they're going to also be exploring, to the best of their ability, additional pay-fors. That might include limiting itemized deductions further. That was one of the main pay-fors they targeted in the first go-around. Some of those are also controversial. But I think I think they're going to make a concerted effort to look at some of those. I mean, I would also add, alternatively, they could consider discretionary spending. I mean, outside of Social Security, Medicare, and interest on the debt, we're going to be spending the government's going to spend $30 trillion over the next decade. I'm sure there is some spending in there that is wasteful and that could be cut. The GEO has written a lot of reports about this. Hopefully, the newly created Department of Government Efficiency, can take some of their recommendations into consideration. But I think that Republicans they're certainly going to pass. They're going to pass something. I think the question is just how large is the tax cut going to be, not whether they'll do one or not.
The entrepreneur and the investor, I think they're wise to, follow what you guys do and be in the know of what the possibilities are, because it will have an impact for sure. You mentioned tariffs. Now, I'm a capitalist, so I'm going to lean towards more capitalism. I love. Well, I won't get on my stump speech about why I think capitalism raises the standard of living. I think it's self-evident that it does. Warren Buffett often says that if you took someone like Rockefeller, the bottom quartile of America has better communication, better food, better medicine, better access to, they just live a higher standard of living than he ever did. And that's because capitalism makes things cheaper. The idea that my cell phone is $1,000, do you know what that would have cost in 1980? And so, to do all of those things it can do. So I'm a huge fan of capitalism. Now, why did I act like that was a caveat? Tariffs, I think, are great little saber rattlers and great to threat and great to go to the negotiation table with. But we want free trade. We want global competition for that very reason. It drives prices down. It's deflationary. And right now, if you learn the lessons from COVID, when you get landlocked and you need to source things from your own country, it's scarcity. The supply chain is smaller. And when there's less supply, more demand, prices go up. So there's, in my opinion, there can be a deflationary nature to free trade, and there's problems with it too. Give me your thought. What are you hearing in your circles on tariffs? Trump has he speaks in hyperbole all the time. Yep. And even the most staunch Republican needs to know, well, that's Trump being Trump, because he just says, he speaks in hyperbole a lot. Yep. He's done so. I don't think he's going to get the tariffs that he wanted, or that he's talking about. I think it's more negotiating and posturing than reality. But what's your thought?
Yeah, so Trump during his campaign, he's sort of been all over the map on this. Even for us, because we're trying to track these policies and model it, and we just we feel like we're just getting whiplash all the time. But look, Trump, he really does seem to like tariffs. He thinks they're a good policy, sometimes even in and of themselves, not even just necessarily as a negotiating tool. And he's floated all kinds of things over this campaign: universal tariffs as high as 20%, raising the tariffs that are already on China to 60%, reintroducing tariffs on Canada and Mexico, even though we negotiated all of those away under USMCA. So he really does seem to be all over the map here, and I think we are going to get. I think we're going to be getting tariffs, another round from his second term. The question is, though, how broad will they be? I mean, it seems like even with the universal tariff,
Right.
he was starting to backtrack, saying, "Well, we're only going to apply this to strategic goods." But right now it's very uncertain even for us. And my overall takeaway, and I actually do want to come back to something you said in your earlier remarks, which is I do think COVID did explore some for sure some of the challenges that we have with our supply chains. But I don't really think that the solution is to simply say we just need to bring everything. We need to just onshore everything, because that also exposes you to supply chain risks. Because it's better to have
Absolutely.
a diversified supply chain, and not. Now, of course, what does that mean? I mean, we could do more sourcing, from other countries in that region, Vietnam, Indonesia, most of Southeast Asia, which is something I'm certainly in favor of. The problem there is, unfortunately, Trump decided, in his first term to withdraw from the TPP negotiations. And I think that had we been a part of that, that would have done a lot to encourage trade in that parts of the world, and also counterbalance China's, ambitions. And, we saw what the repercussions of us withdrawing from that agreement were. I mean, China, they ended up negotiating their own trade agreement, with those countries, which means that they were now setting the terms of trade, rather than the U.S. And I think it's, better when the U.S. has a seat at the table for those things. And I would also add to this, I think the one thing that we also learned, from COVID, and we discussed this when I worked, at the White House at the CA, was that, we really should also consider the value of stockpiling a lot of these critical goods and making sure that we maintain that stockpile as an alternative to saying, well, we're just going to impose tariffs on countries and just try to bring all of our manufacturing in those industries back home. I just think it's not. I just think it's not very realistic, and I think there's a lot of consequences from doing that, and we could I'm happy to explore that even further.
And I also want to circle back to talk a little bit about, you had some timelines on Social Security. I want to get some more time on that too. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick break and do a little commercial. When we come back, we're going to talk more about tariff. We're going to talk about Social Security. I'd like to talk about the proposed corporate tax cut that Trump has talked about. And then I'm going to ask you an opinion on a mystery piece of legislation that I'll bring up and share when we come back.
So far, it's been great. I needed a source where I could really enrich my education through stocks. I didn't really have an avenue for it, and it's helped me a lot. The simplicity has really gotten me on the track to where I enjoy the learning, as well as it's really solidifying in my mind. And like, they're not just trying to sell you something, they really care about the people that are in the course, and they really do care about you and your personal goals, and what you want to do is to help you and your family and whatever your goals are in life through that. So it's really been great.
Welcome back to the Cashflow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner. This is where we make investing simple. I'm here with Alex Durante, and he is, he works in Washington, and he's in the circles that help, give opinions and formulate tax policy. Great blogs. I recommend you Google him. You can go to taxfoundation.org, and you can see the About Us on the staff and read a little bit about Alex there. Tell me a little bit more about, so the tariffs, when you negotiate, you go here and wind up here in reality. Where are they a good thing and where are they a bad thing? What are the pros? Just educate us a little bit on the pros and cons of tariffs. What, on the side that says we should have more of these, what's their argument? And those that say, no, we got to, that's going to bring too much friction to free trade. Tell us about both sides of that argument.
So it seems that proponents of the tariffs some of them are making national security reasons, so that there's certain goods that are critical to our national security, and for those reasons that they should be primarily sourced in the U.S. Rather than abroad or even from China. There's also arguments about in relation to the trade deficit, and that typically gets framed as well. We have this huge trade deficit. It's because we buy more things than we sell, and that sort of gets framed as being a bad thing, which I think is misguided, and I could expound more on that too. But I think it's really coming though mostly from that first point, national security perspective. I mean also I guess a third thing I should mention is there's also a mistaken view, in my opinion, that we need these tariffs to create jobs in America, because having jobs in the U.S. Rather than abroad is good. And I think all three of these arguments I've laid out are mistaken for a few key reasons. I'll start with the national security reason. So look, I mean, I agree. China, they do some bad things. I mean, they steal. They engage in intellectual property theft.
Their thievery is unbelievable.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question about this. I think the question is how do we get them to behave better? The one thing I had already suggested was that we should consider continuing to promote free trade with other countries in the region, because that does act, I think, as a counterbalance to what a lot of Chinese ambitions are. I would also add that we should also use the tools that we have, which would be something like the World Trade Organization, and try to bring more cases against China for a lot of this IP theft and whatnot, because if you look at the record of us bringing cases to the WTO, the U.S. tends to do pretty well in those tribunals. So I think we have mechanisms beyond tariffs to address some of these issues. But of course, I should really get to but even if we have all these these other avenues, why exactly are tariffs themselves bad? And I think when you look at the evidence throughout history, they really don't achieve what a lot of their proponents think they do. So for one, so the big challenge, and we saw this with Trump's first round of tariffs, especially those that were on Chinese imports. A lot of the imports that we get in the U.S. are for these intermediate goods. So these are inputs into production. What that means is that if the costs of those inputs go up, the prices of those final goods they don't necessarily have to go up. I mean, the business could also choose to cut back on investment, but the point is that someone has to pay for that, whether it's the consumer or the importer. So someone in the U.S., whether it's the final consumer or the U.S. firm, is going to be bearing that cost, which I think is contrary to a lot of what we hear in this space, where it's like, oh, well, actually, no, all the costs are falling on China. And look, I mean, we imposed tariffs on them, and imports did fall from China. Obviously, the Chinese firms are not happy about that, but there were also a lot of the costs were also borne by Americans, because if you raise the cost of inputs, someone has to pay for that, and it's going to be a U.S. consumer. And I think the other argument I would also add here is the reason that so some people might say, okay, so we pay higher prices, okay, why is this such a big deal? Well, I think the thing you have to think of is if a consumer is paying a higher price for, say, a domestically produced good that's using this tariffed input, if they have to pay a higher price for that good, that's less money that they have to spend elsewhere in the economy. So what does that mean? Well, it means economic activity throughout the economy has to shrink, because they're just not spending enough money in these other industries. And that's why when you look at our modeling on our website, and also other academics that have looked at this, you find that tariffs actually shrink the economy and make consumers poorer. And
that's my concern.
Yeah, and yeah. I think the evidence largely bears this out. Not even just from the recent round of tariffs, but throughout history, going back when we enacted The Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the 1930s, those were very broad tariffs. We did not see like a resurgence of domestic American manufacturing from that, and we didn't see a resurgence, of domestic American manufacturing from the first round of tariffs that we had several years ago.
It's an interesting thing. Now we're coming up on our time. I want to be respectful. Do you have a minute for a couple more?
Sure. Yep.
Okay. Just want to make sure that we're respectful of your time. Trump has proposed to cut the corporate tax rate. And that's an interesting bet, because what you're really trying to convince people is that by dropping a corporate tax rate, you're actually going to make the pie bigger to where your net income would be larger. And there's precedent for, politicians want to take credit and shift blame. That's just the game. And I remember in the 90s, even when I was younger, guy in the 90s, newly married and didn't know much, I was still cynical enough that I was watching the State of the Union with Clinton, and who was just a great speaker. Back then we had these incredible, Reagan was a great communicator, Clinton was smooth, and he said, the deficit is zero. We do not have a deficit. Most Americans were too stupid to know that that a lot of people thought the debt was wiped out. They didn't know the difference between a debt and a deficit. And really, I didn't know that was because of their fiscal reforms and their what should I call it? Their restraint in spending or their brilliance in taxes. They were a beneficiary of a .com boom in it was just incredible. The amount, the growth in GDP because of the advent of the internet, which Al Gore took credit for inventing, was huge. So I think about AI, and as an investor, the birth and the beginning of AI feels very .com-ish to me, both in the bubble but in the long-term potential. There'll be a FANG trade that comes out of it. There'll be winners and losers. And I just wonder, people are worried about jobs being lost to AI. Certainly more of a risk now, because the blue collar guys, you got to build a robot. White collar guys, AI can replace you pretty easily. It's not that tough. My opinion, though, is I would rather keep employees that can be 10 times more productive than lay them off. And I think that's what AI does across the board. Food companies, fuel companies. It isn't just the tech and the Nokia or the NVIDIA. It's not just NVIDIA that's going to do well. Every single person that has a business will do better. So maybe, you drop a corporate tax rate, and maybe President Trump someday, 4 years from now, gets to say the deficit's zero because we were so brilliant when it was AI. We have a repeat of Clinton. I don't think that happens, though, because the promised money is so large. Our debt to GDP ratio is going to continue to climb, in my opinion. So what's your thought on the cutting of the corporate tax rate, in the idea that the net freedom of growth, that all that money would go into growth instead of profits into the pockets of the rich?
So I'm going to speak. So I'll speak to the evidence that we have. When we cut the corporate tax rate back in 2017. So before that, the corporate rate was at 35% under first Trump term. It was cut to 21%. Now, there's a lot of disagreements over, what were actually the effects of this tax cut, and I will say that this is something that it is very difficult to measure, and it was even doubly more difficult to measure because only a couple of years later did we have COVID. So a lot of the academic papers that have looked at this, they really look at what was the effect of the corporate rate tax cut and other corporate rate provisions between, say, 2018 to just before COVID. And what they've generally found, and there was a very good paper coming from, I would say center left of center academics that looked at some of the investment incentives that were part of that tax cut plan. And what they found was very strong investment responses to tax.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, did they find the wage growth effects that people had promised? Now, here's where things get a little more difficult.
That's where COVID.
Yes.
That's where COVID really throws a wrench in.
Here's where things get more difficult because, and we talk about this in all the pieces that we've written about this. You sort of have to the mechanics of how a increase in wages works through a corporate tax cut is a little bit. I think it's a little bit difficult for maybe some people to grasp, but. When we think of that mechanism, it's really happening through the investment channel, which could take years. So the idea is that you cut the rate, the corporate tax rate that increases incentives to invest. So firms say they buy more capital. They need human labor to operate a lot of this capital, so they hire more workers. And then over time, you sort of see a bidding up of the wages because the demand for capital is so much higher. In many cases, capital is a complement to labor, and therefore those wages go up. The problem is you're not really going to see you're not necessarily going to go in to see this looking at just 1 year or two of data. And what tended to happen, I think, in the short term is what we saw is a lot of the corporate tax cuts went as basically a huge windfall to shareholders. And this immediately turned off a lot of people from the policy because they're like, well, why, you were saying, you were going to do this policy to help workers and it's all going to shareholders. And there's two things I would say to that. One is, well, that is true in the short term, that shareholders benefit. Even our own model, the way we model corporate tax cuts, we show that. And then we show over time the burden of the corporate tax, or rather the benefit of a corporate tax cut in this case, increasingly falls on labor. So over time, those benefits do accrue to labor. But I will add one more thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing if shareholders get a windfall and then they have that money that they could choose to invest in other businesses. There was this huge.
As an investor, I agree with that.
I mean,
I don't know if everyone.
But the thing is, a lot of people. I mean, at the time, a lot of people. There was this huge push during the Biden administration, which was enacted, which was to do a stock buyback tax. There was a huge outcry over this.
That's crazy.
And and our perspective is that this isn't really something that's bad for economic growth. You want firms to be able to invest in firms freely and have this exchange of capital. And the idea that this is something that should be discouraged, I think is misguided.
That I was going to use the word misguided.
Yep.
People that don't like buybacks, to demonize stock buybacks, to me is one of the more sinister political narratives that doesn't reflect reality of what it does. Just as printing money dilutes the value of a currency, concentrating the float increases the value of a stock. And if the CEO is a stockholder, that's to their benefit to concentrate that value. Certainly it's to the advantage, but it also is a massive endorsement. There's no better endorsement than when someone wants to buy their own stock. Berkshire Hathaway bought a lot of their own stock back and reduced their float a little bit. So I just don't think it's not the ploy. There's no games to it. Your value's the same. Net, the pie is the same size. It's just there's less slices in it. That's it. So it's an interesting thing. Last thing I'll have you comment on. This has been so beneficial, and the reason I think these conversations are great for people is it helps you guide. You see the carrot and the stick of tax policy, and it helps you guide decisions, particularly how it may shape the macroeconomic picture. Warren Buffett will say, well, I don't really look at that stuff, and I can see, is my business good or not long term, but I really do care. I think that the unsustainable nature, you mentioned the Social Security, the unsustainable nature, these are not minor vicissitudes. These are catastrophic. And I think you can say things always bounce back. Well, They didn't for Rome, and they didn't for the British Empire. You don't always bounce back. You can lose your place in the world. So I'm going to tell you a story you're probably familiar with. It's more for the benefit of our listeners, but I want them to have an appreciation for what you do and the difficulty of shaping tax policy. And here's a little story, because you mentioned how hard it is to even see what the ramifications were in the past. How did this affect us? It's hard to see. Well, now even harder is, what are the ramifications? If we have a tariff, does it work? Monetary policy, tax, fiscal policy, and trade policy, all are trying to shape the future. And we're all trying to predict the future as we shape it. And the defining characteristic of investing is unpredictability, perhaps. So here's a fun story. So I interviewed a man named Richard Stanger. Are you familiar with him by chance?
I am not.
So this is something that you can go to your buddies in the office and talk about, because this is an interesting thing. So Jimmy Carter, the late Jimmy Carter, with all respect to the late president, he struggled. I mean, I grew up in his presidency. I remember as a young man the energy problems, and particularly I remember the hostages in Iran. Growing up, it was just really affected me as a young man. So he just couldn't get anything going right, President Carter. So he decided to do tax reform, and he says, let's see if we can get something happening in tax reform. And there was a congressman in upstate New York named Barbara Conable, and he was on the House Ways and Means Committee. And there had been a huge pushback from the bankruptcy of the Studebaker Company to solidify pensions through ERISA, which you're absolutely familiar with. And the Employee Income Retirement Security Act, ERISA, had put a freeze on bonuses that were going to be new. In other words, back then the marginal tax rate was 75% on bonuses. So if you're a rich bank exec, you get a $10,000 Christmas bonus, you take home $2,500 of it. I mean, it was rough. And so they had these deferral programs where you could put it away, like in an IRA or tax deferred, and then you got to keep your bonus. Well, ERISA put a freeze on those. They said, well, grandfather in the old ones, but we won't allow any new ones. So Barbara Conable has some constituents in his ear, an executive from Kodak and an executive from Xerox, and they say, hey, you guys are working on new tax policy, under the Carter administration. Can you help us out with some of our bonuses? Can you help us out and maybe slide something in here? So Conable Barber hires a bright young lawyer out of Temple University. It was his first job, named Richard Stanger. And he said, Richard, I want you to write some legislation that can help my buddies out. And so he writes this, and it's 800 words. Little tax policy. It's only 800 words. And they had to put a name on it. And they said they ran it through the IRS, and they ran it through the Congressional Budget Office and the Treasury to figure out what the ramifications would be. In other words, how much revenue would we lose annually if we enacted this little policy from Barbara Conable in these 800 words. And they came back and said that the ramifications of the federal budget would be less than $1 million a year. And I about fell out of my chair when I heard that. And Richard Stanger says that was weird, because either the reason to enact it didn't exist because we weren't helping anybody, or those numbers were way, way off. Well, the section that Richard Stanger wrote at 800 words got a name in the tax policy. It's called Section 401k. And today, there's $11 trillion in 401k plans. And I'd imagine the deferred taxes on that are a little more than $1 million. And it was interesting because as I interviewed Richard, I said, did you ever think when you were writing that tax policy that you were actually writing your own 401k plan? Because that was in 78. And in 1981, Ted Benna found this and said, he was consulting with a bank. He said, you know what, this would make a heck of a retirement program. We could use this 401k, and we will bait people with an employee match to get them to get into it. and we could have them defer taxes. And it changed, it extinguished pensions, killed all the pensions in the United States, and became the predominant retirement vehicle, which it was off-label use. So the point is you got to have some empathy for the people that develop tax policy, because they're trying to predict the future, and often they have no idea. To kind of finish that story about Barbara Conable, 20 years later, he'd written his memoir, which is called Congress and the Tax Policy in the Congress, and it gave all the speeches he'd given. It was a collection, not one mention of the most resultant legislation ever passed, not one. No. He was completely oblivious to it. By the 90s, we had the first trillion in there, and he was nominated by an investment magazine as one of the finalists for Man of the Century. And he goes to the country club, and his buddy's like, "Hey man, congratulations, you're Man of the Century. That's quite a nomination." And he says, "What? I did what?" He had to call up the House Ways and Means Committee and say, "Did I have anything to do with the 401k?" For 20 years, he had no idea what he'd done. So I'd like you to speak to that story and the difficulty of trying to, enact tax policy or tariff policy, because you have no idea sometimes that you could change the world. Do you guys ever think about stuff like that?
I mean,
do you find that interesting?
Yeah, thank you for that story. I'll have to share it with my other younger colleagues as well, who were not here for that. Yeah, I mean, look, we have enough time. I mean, to be quite honest, I mean, even predicting what's going to happen in next week, let alone 10 years out. But nonetheless,
Yeah.
I mean, look, it's like we are, we have a tax model. We do 10-year forecasts, much like the Joint Committee on Taxation, Congressional Budget Office. We'd like to hope that that we get it right. But it's but again, I mean, look, the farther out, like the reality is of all economic all modeling in general, the farther you go out into the future, the harder it becomes to predict things, and that's just something we all have to grapple with. but we try to do our very best.
The thing I found in Richard Stanger is, people want to lay blame for this or that, or if things work out or if they don't, credit and blame. And the thing I got, where I love to talk to guys like you with boots on the ground, what I find invariably are really good people that are just trying to find really good solutions to problems that are very, very difficult to solve. Yep. So the moral of the story, I think, is people should listen to what you got. They should pay attention to what you're doing. They should watch what you're doing, so they're better informed to prepare themselves and have that individual responsibility and feel the weight of the individual responsibility to position yourself well, come what may. Yeah. I'll give you the last word. What's your feeling on the education of the electorate? When people go into the voting booth, do you feel they have an appreciation for monetary policy, fiscal policy, and trade policy, or do you think we can improve our education?
I mean, look, I think I think the main reason the election went the way it did is that people really hate inflation, and I think that was and a lot of people it was at the top of people's
grocery store.
Yep, top of people's concerns, and that's something that this administration is also going to have to grapple with. I mean, look, as an economist, it's difficult because I always tell people, look, the price level is mainly up to the Monetary Authority, the Federal Reserve Board, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can't do in the legislature to try to at least bring costs down in different sectors, whether that's through tax policy or deregulatory efforts. But I do agree with you though. I wish the public maybe had a little bit more appreciation for what we do. And I could just tell I mean, even in DC here, I mean, across the political spectrum, I mean, everyone in this tax policy space, I mean, they all have their own viewpoints, but everyone is generally very civil. We have civil disagreements. I think that's something that your listeners should at least be aware of, is that economists that work in tax policy probably I think most of the time agree more than they disagree, but we always tend to focus on the disagreements.
Well, every time I've talked with guys like you, I've come away with these are pretty good guys, and they're doing a pretty good job. My prediction is I don't think, here I said I'd give you the last word and then I took it. My prediction is that the deficit's going to get bigger. I don't think whether you had Harris or another Biden or Trump or whoever, that's a problem so large and on such a grand scale that I think we're naive to think that a party can solve it. It will take the people to solve it. And there'll be some tightening of the belt that has to happen at some point. I would love to see education, particularly financial education, where young people began to invest in shares and ownership of this GDP at a younger age and begin compounding at age 13, 14, 15. Because then the way to share the wealth and redistribute wealth is not by redistributing money, it's by redistributing ownership. Because if you have a COVID policy where, well, let's send everyone a check, that money goes right back in the pockets of businesses because they spend the money. And it is always the producers that collect the wealth, never the consumers. And so the way to get more equality is to teach young people. I get excited about a tax cut corporate because my sons are shareholders. They're not big Wall Street guys. They don't sit around and smoke big fat cigars in the back of a limo. They own companies like Apple. They own companies like Kraft. They own companies like Citibank. And I see my sons getting wealthy if they share. Warren Buffett just did a real good job of it starting young. That's it. His companies are yawners. It's Chevron. It's Coke, it's Moody's, it's American Express. These are not the best stocks in the world. They're not Tesla that went through the roof. He bought Apple in 2016, for hell's sakes. I mean, he just owned American business. And so as people listen to what you have to say, you don't say, oh, if this benefits shareholders, that doesn't help me. Become a shareholder. Understand that you are to partner with the government and understand, we're going to give a tax break for drilling for oil. Then go drill for some oil and you get to enjoy the oil well profits because we want more energy. You're going to do a tax break for providing housing or as a business or providing jobs. Do what the government is asking you to do. Partner with them and they'll give you the tax breaks, which are well deserved. So Alex, thank you for the work that you do and do your best out there in that town of DC and try to survive all the nuttiness in our world, but beneath the surface, all that. We thank you for your service and the things you do.
Great. Well, thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure talking to you.
When some of this stuff plays out, I hope we can have you back and give us a report on the next round of things.
Yep, absolutely. Happy to do it again.
And hang on for a bit after I close the show so I can properly thank you. You've been watching and listening to the Cashflow Academy podcast. Hit your like, subscribe button. And don't forget, go to that website, yourinvestingclass.com, because I have 6 numbers there that'll change your life. And if you study those 6 numbers, sounds cliched, that'll change my life. It really will. There are 6 numbers. If you measure them, there's a power to those that'll be life-changing. So with that, we'll see you next time.